DNS Part 2. In this nugget, we continue our discussion of DNS, and this will be Part 2. We first of all talk about Active Directory domains, and this really has two meanings. Active Directory domains in terms of the security boundary, how users log on, where the accounts are stored and all that, but also in terms of DNS, because a DNS zone can correlate to an Active Directory domain of the same name. So we'll go ahead and install Active Directory and see how that works. Then we'll also see that it's going to create a subzone on its configured DNS server. When you do something like that, you might need to consider various WAN considerations. Now, WAN considerations are something we kind of discussed throughout this series. But in terms of DNS, you need to be careful about things such as zone transfers and Active Directory replication. You might need to then move your Active Directory zone. We'll talk about doing that. We'll also see that you miss some records or miss some pretty important things when you move that zone, but we'll show you how to reconstruct those as well. Then you will also take a look at delegations. And a delegation, as well as a stub zone, are two ways of being able to reference child domains or child zones without having to do full zone transfers, so they save on your network traffic. And then, in terms of specifically stub zones, they don't have to be for child zones only, but they're often used for child zones in place of delegations, which is kind of an older way of doing, and stub zones are a better way of doing things these days. Recall from our previous nugget that we had a primary DNS server zone up here, nuggetlab.com, on this DNS server that had dynamic registrations of a couple hundred laptops as well as its other servers and stuff like that going on up in this zone. Because it had frequent updates to the zone file, it was having to do zone transfers frequently and large zone transfers across this relatively slow WAN link to this secondary nuggetlab.com server. Well, we wanted to conserve WAN traffic, so we made it a caching-only server where it just pointed this DNS server to this DNS server for its answers, and it cached any results that it got back. That left us with only Q&A traffic, query and answer traffic across the WAN link. Now, the problem with that is it's a little bit primitive because now we have things called Active Directory integrated zones. So we might as well use what we got there, right? In this case, what we could do is to upgrade this to an Active Directory integrated zone for nuggetlab.com. That means that this would not only be a DNS server, but also a domain controller, so we can perform all of our credentials, we can get things updated securely. In fact, these laptops and all the other hosts up here now will perform secure registrations against the nuggetlab.com zone, so we've also improved security. Now, down here we still have our normal caching going on, but if these workstations and other servers that are down here also have to log on to nuggetlab.com in terms of the Active Directory domain of nuggetlab.com, then they're going to have to perform their logons also across this WAN link, as well as things such as updating Kerberos tickets, which are used for security purposes, for updating timestamps for their time registration, because these clients and workstations down here will update their local time with the domain controller, which is located up here in Phoenix. So that's not going to be any good because we got that traffic going across as well. And it's not overwhelming, but it's just more traffic. So it might make more sense in this case to even go away from caching down here now to convert this back to now an Active Directory DNS domain controller, again for nuggetlab.com. So now we have a domain controller down here, domain controller up here. We will still have traffic that goes back and forth across here, though, because again, we have these frequent registrations, and we'll have transfers back and forth across our Active Directory here. Now, one thing we can do with that is, with Active Directory sites and services, which is kind of another topic on its own, we can schedule this so it doesn't happen too often, and so that it happens during non-peak periods of time, like at 3 a.m. or something like that. And that will then still allow us to log on locally, to get our resources locally, to get our name resolution here locally without having to use the WAN traffic except for when it's not being used anyway. So then once it's all configured, we have nuggetlab.com, which is a DNS server on a domain controller at the root of the forest here. And a forest is a collection of domains that have intrinsic trust relationships one with another. And then we'll have an Active Directory domain controller down here, also in the same domain for nuggetlab.com. And that way, we can have these logons take place locally, and we can have DNS queries and DNS registrations take place locally here as well, with our updates taking place only during non-peak times as scheduled using the Active Directory sites and services. So now Benson's pretty well taken care of. Oh, by the way, I mentioned also in our last nugget that Cochise the Apache Indian had been accused of kidnapping a 12-year-old red-headed, one-eyed boy. Well, if he didn't kidnap that boy, whatever happened to the boy? In case you're wondering, he was actually kidnapped by a different band of Apaches known as the Coyotero Apaches, and he learned Spanish, Apache, as well as his native tongue, English, very well, and he later on became a valued Army scout. And some people also claim that he was a psychopathic killer. Anyway, he died in older years on an Apache Indian reservation. Now then, what does all that have to do with Active Directory and domains and replication and all that kind of stuff? Absolutely nothing, but I've got the microphone, so I get to say it if I want. Okay, now let's move on over to here into this site. We've got a new branch office in Tucson, Arizona, where we've got a whole bunch more salespeople that we've opened up to this office. And now we've got laptops coming in and out of here. Sometimes they travel from Phoenix to Tucson, and we've got their own sales force down here. So we've got about 100 more laptops that come in and out of Tucson doing registrations. Now, we could put them in their own domain, such as Tucson, or TUC for short, .nuggetlab.com. And in fact, in order to reflect some autonomy on behalf of this domain and how they're set up a little bit more independently from our original domain here, we can go ahead and do that. And before we do that, let me go ahead and point out what I've kind of correlated here. I've got a domain controller, which is the same server that I'm working on right now, dcnugget1 at the root of the forest and nuggetlab.com here. And then I've got dcnugget2, which I've set up as a peer domain controller for Benson, Arizona. It's already another active domain controller in our existing environment. And then what I'm about to do is to set up dcnugget3 to host tucson.nuggetlab.com, and I'm going to spell it all out. It won't be abbreviated in that actual domain. So let's go ahead and go to dcnugget3, where I've already got a logon in progress. And although Active Directory is not really a topic in our existing series, I'm going to go ahead and install Active Directory on this domain controller, so on this server, so that we can go ahead and see how it affects DNS. So I'll just type dcpromo from a command line, and once you type dcpromo, it starts the Active Directory installation wizard. Now then, before I continue the wizard, let me first point out and remind us what the actual configured network settings are for this local area network connection on dcnugget3. If I go to TCP/IP and look at the DNS settings, it's pointing at 10.10.10.20, which is the DNS and domain controller for nuggetlab.com. So, bearing that in mind, as I click on next here, we're going to see that comes into play a little bit later on. What's going to happen by the time I'm done with this Active Directory installation wizard is it's going to automatically create a subdomain underneath nuggetlab.com. So we'll go ahead and create a domain controller for a new domain, because it's going to be a new domain, a new child domain, and it's going to be a child domain in an existing domain tree instead of a new forest or a domain tree in an existing forest. So we'll go ahead and create a child domain, and then we'll enter in a username for the credentials for this, someone with enterprise admin capabilities, or membership actually. And then there's the parent domain. Now I have to specify what the name of the child domain is. I guess I will just abbreviate Tucson, TUC, and then it'll be tuc.nuggetlab.com. I can't do it that way. I gotta do Tucson. Tucson.nuggetlab.com. Alright, so I'm gonna go ahead and click on next here. And we'll wait for it to try to resolve tucson.nuggetlab.com as a DNS name. It's not going to be able to find that on the DNS server quite yet. And we'll see that in a moment. It's automatically created that. Here's the flat.net BIOS name of the domain, and then it specifies where we want to store the database and the log files for Active Directory, as well as the sysvol folder, which holds things such as certain kinds of scripts, legacy scripts, as well as things like group policy objects. So I'll go ahead and click on Next here, and then we'll see that it has performed a DNS registration diagnostic, and its gone to its designated DNS server, which is this one right here, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, and the zone was nuggetlab.com, and what we'll see happen here is it's going to go ahead and create that subdomain. Now, we can specify permissions compatible only with current versions of Windows operating systems, which helps to avoid certain security vulnerabilities with anonymous users if we had used only pre-Windows 2000 server operating systems like NT4. And then we'll enter in a restore mode password, which we might need to know if we needed to do any troubleshooting with this particular domain controller, and then we'll click on Next. And then the NetBIOS name of the domain is Tucson. Here's what we really want to see. The new domain is named tucson.nuggetlab.com. That is both the name of the Active Directory domain as well as the DNS domain. We click on Next, let it do its thing, and I'll come back to you when this is all finished and rebooted. Now then, once we've gone ahead and done that, let's go ahead and it's already rebooted, and it's up on a different screen right now that you can't see. Once it's already done all that, let me go back into DNS now, and we'll take a look at dcnugget1. Here's dcnugget3. It does have DNS on it, but right now we don't have any zones on it. Well, you're thinking to yourself, James, I thought you said that you could make a DNS server also an Active Directory domain controller. Wouldn't they both be the same thing then? Well, not necessarily, because in this case, since dcnugget3 was pointing to dcnugget1 for its configured DNS server, it went ahead and used dcnugget1 to create a subzone of Tucson right here underneath the forward lookup zones under nuggetlab.com. Now, if DC Nugget 3 had been pointing to itself for its own DNS name resolution and was not able to find any zones, then it would have created its own zones, and the wizard would have prompted you to create zones. And it could actually, the DC Promo wizard can configure all of that for you automatically. So if it's not able to find anything, that's a real easy way to go, is just let the wizard do it for you. Now, another thing we ought to consider with this is the use of our WAN traffic again, because you see, at this point, this is not a DNS server, so you see I scratched out DNS there. This is just a domain controller. How do these clients find this domain controller? Well, first they have to query a DNS server in tucson.nuggetlab.com to find something called an SRV record. An SRV record simply identifies a specific service that a host will be able to perform. In this case, we're looking for a logon server or a domain controller. So they have to query this DNS server up here to find an SRV record, sends the answer back. They find out that the local domain controller is actually right next to them in their own site down here. They perform their logons. The next thing that happens is when these clients perform their dynamic updates, they're doing that across the WAN link as well. And remember, we've got a lot of laptop users here coming on and off the networks. They're performing dynamic registrations across this 256K WAN link. Now, 256 is better than 128 or 56K, but it's still not lightning fast, and we want to conserve our bandwidth as much as possible. So what might be a better idea then is to take the subdomain on nuggetlab.com, which is tucson.nuggetlab.com, and put that instead down here on this domain controller. And as a result of that, when these clients come on to find an SRV record, they're able to find it from a local DNS server. And when they perform logons, they can do that locally immediately without having to first query across this WAN link. And overall, it's just more efficient use of the local network and a conservation of the WAN link. Now then, how am I going to actually do that? Well, let's go to DNS management here, where I've got all of our servers in one console. And here I've got my existing Tucson domain. Notice that it also includes other types of subdomains that are relative to domain controllers, and that's what it uses to help identify what site it's in, to help identify SRV records, put SRV records in there, and things of this nature, as well as the actual host record for that domain controller. Now, here's what you do. Believe it or not, you right-click on this. If we're going to put tucson.nuggetlab.com down on this DNS server, we're going to right-click on it and choose Delete. Delete, yes, okay. Well, then we go back down here to DC Nugget 3, and we create a new zone here, next, and we create a primary zone that's going to be stored this time in Active Directory. Now, if you're going to store it in Active Directory, you also have to specify where in Active Directory it's going to be stored, which application directory partition it's going to be stored in. A partition in DNS, then, is a special segment of the Active Directory data that's going to be replicated, and it's going to be replicated only to a certain scope of destination computers. In this case, we could specify to all domain controllers in the Active Directory domain tucson.nuggetlab.com. So if I have additional domain controllers, it's going to go to all of them regardless of whether or not they're also DNS servers. You don't want to choose this option unless those other domain controllers are also Windows 2000 servers. The reason for that is Windows 2000 servers do not understand application directory partitions. They're not able to make that distinction. If I had all Windows Server 2003 servers, then I could choose to all DNS servers in the Active Directory domain, tucson.nuggetlab.com. And that way, if I had other domain controllers here, and only those domain controllers that were also DNS servers would get this zone data replication. Then also, I could choose to all DNS servers in the Active Directory forest of nuggetlab.com, and that would mean just that. All domain controllers that are also DNS servers throughout the entire forest would get this data. We'll just go ahead and go to all DNS servers in the Active Directory domain of tucson.nuggetlab.com and hit Next. And then I'll type in the name of tucson.nuggetlab.com for the zone name and hit Next, and we'll make it only secure dynamic updates, which if you want dynamic updates from your normal generic clients at all, that's what you should always choose because you want to be as secure as possible. And then we'll click Next and Finish, and that's pretty much it. Now, however, as you look at this, tucson.nuggetlab.com, it looks initially, okay, yeah, you need a startup authority, there's that, there's the name server record of DC Nugget 3, here's the host record, so there's what we also call the glue record, which associates with this name server record. It looks okay to me, but remember when we looked at the subdomain of tucson.nuggetlab.com up here earlier, where it also had this underscore MSDCS sites, TCP, UDP, had all that kind of stuff. Well, where's all that now? It's missing, as you can see. In this scenario, if I actually did have any clients in Tucson.nuggetlab.com, they'd have a heck of a time logging on because there are no SRV records or any of the other information necessary to identify this domain controller in this lookup zone. So what we will have to do then is to fix that, and we'll go to DC Nugget 3 directly for that. And the first thing we have to do is to point this now to itself as its own DNS server. So we'll right-click on its local area network connection here, and instead of pointing it to 20 over here, we'll point it to 23, which is the IP address of this local DNS server. And the next thing we'll do is, if we've already installed the support tool that is on the Windows Server 2003 CD-ROM, then we can go into a command prompt here, and we're going to use a command called netdiag /fix. And that looks for its zone on the configured DNS server, and if it's missing those records, it automatically fixes them. So then I'll just go ahead and press enter to go ahead and have it run tests. That's what netdiag does. It runs tests on the domain controller and sees if there's any problems with it, and will then, if it finds any problems, it can fix them if you specify the /fix. And here we saw that it was not properly registered in DNS. There it is. DNS test failed, and therefore it registered all the stuff that was missing within DNS. So having exited out of that now, we'll go to DNS and see that it's all put back in there just fine. And now returning to the DNS console, we see that indeed it has put back in all of these _MSDCS and so on and so forth up here, and we're back in business. Now then, we might have another issue here. You see, I've got salespeople going back and forth between these two offices. I have some users from nuggetlab.com coming down here, and when they log on, they need to find the DNS server that can identify where their domain controller is so that they can log on across the WAN. It's not always a bad thing. Sometimes you have to log on across the WAN, and that's what they'll need to be able to do when they're hooking their laptops up down here in Tucson. Likewise, down in Tucson, I've got these laptop users that move up to Phoenix from time to time for quarterly meetings and all that kind of stuff. When they plug into the network up here, they need this DNS server to locate their domain controller, and it'll say, oh, your domain controller is down in Tucson, so we'll send you across the WAN link to log on. Well, the way things are configured right now, none of that will be able to happen. These clients will only be able to log on to this domain controller when they're actually in their site. And these clients can only log on to their domain controller when they're in their site. The reason why is that neither one of these Active Directory integrated domain controllers has knowledge of the other domain. Alright, so we do have a problem. Let's first of all confirm that we actually do have a problem on our end here from DC Nugget 1, where I'm locally seated at this current time. And I'm going to try to ping dcnugget3.tucson.nuggetlab.com. Can't find it. Well, that makes sense because we have no knowledge of that zone on DC Nugget 1 and no way of pointing to this Tucson.nuggetlab.com zone where we have the host record that we need to find. So, in order to resolve this, we have one of two methods. You could either use a delegation or a stub zone, which is better than a delegation. But we're just going to start with a delegation because there are a lot of other implementations of DNS that use it, a lot of different brands of DNS that use it, like Unix Bind, and also because it's kind of the basis of being able to resolve child domains. So we'll right-click here and choose New Delegation and click Next through the wizard. Then we'll enter in the delegated domain, that is the child portion of the domain we're trying to resolve, which would be Tucson. And notice it automatically fills the rest in for us. That's because I right-clicked on the nuggetlab.com domain when I started this, so it's really modifying that portion of the domain. And then we'll click on Next. Then we add in the name server that we have here, which is dcnugget3.tucson.nuggetlab.com, which is at this IP address. And again, you can resolve it if it has a method for resolving it, but we just saw that it couldn't. So we'll click on Add, and then we'll click OK, and then Next, and that's pretty much it. Now we just click on Finish. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and try to see if it's resolved the problem. What's it done? First of all, it's entered in an NS record, and that's really all the wizard does, is it creates an NS record for whatever you typed in there in the wizard. In this case, I typed it in properly at dcnugget3.tucson.nuggetlab.com. Now let's go ahead and confirm that we have a problem fixed here. First thing I need to do is to ipconfig, actually not ping, but ipconfig flush DNS, and then a DNS command clear cache. So having typed both of these in, I've cleared it out so I don't have any negative acknowledgments in the cache for this negative acknowledgement for DC Nugget 3 that I got earlier. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and try to ping it again. So then I ping dcnugget3.tucson.nuggetlab.com, and now I'm successfully getting replies, which is a simple way to confirm that it's all set up properly and I can properly communicate with that zone and with the name server. Now let me point out another thing here, and that is that it's very thin in what it actually gives you in the delegation. It only gives me the NS record, or the name server record. Now behind the scenes there, and not really visible in the console, is the fact that it's also got a glue record for the IP address to dcnugget3.tucson.nuggetlab.com. In other words, the host record. And that was evident when I created the zone using the wizard. I had to type in the IP address for the master DNS server. So that's actually there, just not really visible in our current implementation. Now, the other thing to note here is that if I go to the actual zone at tucson.nuggetlab.com, it doesn't have any of these subdomains. It doesn't have the start of authority or any other host. For example, here I manually put in another host, client02 at 10.10.10.42. It doesn't get any of that. Again, just the NS records, just the name server records, because I don't want a whole zone transfer. That's the whole point. I don't want to transfer all of this as a secondary up to this zone. I'm trying to conserve on zone transfer traffic and just point my clients to the appropriate name server record, or my DNS server in this case, to the appropriate name server record, so that I can resolve the names my clients want on their behalf without all the zone transfer traffic. Now let's look at a couple of other things. First of all, notice that you do have a visual clue here as well, that it is a delegation. Notice how it's kind of dimmed out just a little bit in color there compared to these other little folder-looking icons here. And then the other thing is, let's confirm that it's also working from another perspective, and that's from using an NS lookup tool. NS lookup is the name of the tool. And you can run the command from one line. For example, if I wanted to know an answer for a specific host, I could do NS lookup, and then I could enter in dcnugget3.tucson.nuggetlab.com, and it uses this DNS server to get a non-authoritative answer, which again is a good answer. It just means that it didn't answer it out of its own zones here on this DNS server. And the answer there was dcnugget3.tucson.nuggetlab.com is found at 10.10.10.23. That's all we were trying to find out. I can also run NS lookup, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do with NS lookup. It's pretty much the first tool you use if you're really doing any in-depth DNS troubleshooting. Anyway, I'll do NS lookup this time, and I can also set type, so I can look up a certain type of resource. So I'll do set type, and let's say I want to find out information about the name server record for dcnugget3. So in the set type equals NS, and then I'll do again just the name of the server. So dcnugget3.tucson.nuggetlab.com, and press enter, and now it gives me answers about that server. It tells me what server resolved the query for me, tells me where it's located. It's in the Tucson child domain.nuggetlab.com. It tells me the primary name server, which is dcnugget3. I've only got one for the time being, and other information which I'll explain later on when we look at more detail about the start of authority record. But that's where all of this stuff comes from. It comes from the start of authority, or the SOA record. Now, there's also an intrinsic problem with delegations. For example, if I go back to my diagram over here, remember that I have dcnugget3 as my Active Directory integrated DNS server, so now it has, again, a DNS server. And then what if I wanted to add in another DNS server down here, dcnugget4, I'll just put dcn4 for dcnugget4 here, and I wanted it to also host tucson.nuggetlab.com. Well, that would be just fine. However, in the delegation, you're going to see in a moment that it's going to have a problem with that. So in order to make that work, first of all, since dcnugget4 is not a domain controller, I'm just going to go down here to its forward lookup zones and create a new zone and make a secondary to the primary, or the Active Directory integrated zone, over on dcnugget3. So I'll choose to make it a secondary zone. Again, it's not a domain controller, so it doesn't have Active Directory capability for storage. And then I'll enter in the name of the zone at tucson.nuggetlab.com, and then we'll hit next here. And then the IP address of the master server, which is 10.10.10.23 for dcnugget3, and then next and finish. And you saw me do that earlier, so I kind of quickly went through it. Now remember, the other thing I'd have to do here then is to go to this zone and give it permission to do zone transfers to that other name server. So I'll go to name servers here, add in now dcnugget4, dcnugget4.nuggetlab.com, and if I can, I will resolve, and I did, so I'll just go ahead and accept that and click OK, and then OK. Now, remember that the default properties, let me go back real quick, the default properties for zone transfers are to any servers listed on the Name Servers tab. However, in this case, I had deselected that item, so I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I've got that confirmed. And then what we're going to do is to go down to dcnugget4, where we have this zone. Now I'll have to do my little trick again here of transferring from the master again, and then restarting the server and all that stuff, so I'll come back to you in just a moment. Actually, that happened pretty quick this time. I just right-clicked and chose transfer from master, and it took place almost immediately, fortunately this time. So anyway, now we've got another DNS server on dcnugget4 that can also answer queries for anything in tucson.nuggetlab.com. The problem is here, up on DC Nugget 1, which is located, remember, up here in Phoenix, we might want to take advantage of the fact that there's another DNS server down here, because maybe DC Nugget 3 is getting slammed with too much traffic and it's kind of slow to respond sometimes. So we want to be able to use this other DC Nugget 4, but these administrators down here decided not to tell us that they were installing another DNS server. So we don't know anything about it up here in Phoenix. And if we go to the Tucson zone and I hit refresh and refresh and refresh and refresh, it's never, ever, ever going to show me DC Nugget 4 as another name server down there. Why? Because these delegated zones are just static. They don't do anything to automatically update themselves. And I got to get an email or a voicemail or some other communique from a DNS manager down in that Tucson site to tell me that they've got this new DC Nugget 4 server hosting tucson.nuggetlab.com as a secondary. Now, once I do get word of that new name server, I can right-click on the delegation here and choose Properties, and then I can just add this in, and then just add it in. Just enter in its fully qualified domain name, IP address, and hit OK, and now we've got both of them in here. Then we'll see that they both appear. But that's a manual process, and there's no way to really automate that with a delegation. Likewise, if that had changed now, then I'd have to, again, go to this and go to its properties. And if we no longer using with this one, then I'd have to remove it manually as well. And again, there's no way to do this automatically either. So, of course, that presents a problem because there's no automation with the delegations. But the advantage of both a delegation and a stub zone is that they do not have to use zone transfers. So we're going to avoid that heavy network traffic of large zone transfers. Instead, we're just pointing to the authoritative name servers that handle the zone that we're trying to look up. Now, with a stub zone, which I'm about to create, I can do that up here on DC Nugget 1. And first I'm going to do is to delete the delegation, because you don't have a delegation and a stub zone on the same server for the same zone. So I'll right-click here and choose Delete, and then I'll click on Yes to delete that zone. Now I'll go right up here to Forward Lookup Zones to right-click and choose a new stub zone. So we'll do this by right-clicking on the zone and choosing New Zone, and then going through the wizard where we create a stub zone to store an Active Directory. And this time I'm going to store it in all DNS servers and Active Directory domain of nuggetlab.com because I'm not using Windows 2000 DNS servers. So I'll go ahead and click on Next. Then I'll browse for the zone if I want to, or again, you could also have just typed it in. I'm too lazy to type right now, plus you know how badly I type. So I'll just type or enter in this way, tucson.nuggetlab.com, entered with the IP address of the master server, which is 10.10.10.23. Now, here we also have a checkbox that says use the above servers to create a local list of master servers. If 10.10.10.23 was nearest to my own site, or if it was actually in my same site, then that might be the best DNS server to retrieve a list of NS, host, and or glue records, and also of the startup authority record. Maybe I have a secondary server for the same zone out in Singapore. Well, I wouldn't want to use it, so I wouldn't type its IP address in here and consider that to be a local master server, because then it would be going across a gigantic WAN link or maybe even a satellite hop every time it tried to pull any updates to that zone. So you use this to prefer only local servers when possible, and it's not a bad idea to use, especially if you have a geographically dispersed location. And then you just saw that I just finished the wizard. Pretty simple there. Now what I'll do is go to tucson.nuggetlab.com. Once again, I've got to do my little trick of refreshing and everything like that. When I'm done with that, I'll come back and see you again here. And we see that I finally got it to appear here. Now, let me point out some other things here on how you can refresh or reload this information. First of all, if I've already got all the information here, or if it's already been loaded in the past, then I could just reload it out of the existing cache from the local DNS server here. The other thing I could do is to transfer from master, and what that does is it takes a look at the SOA record on this stub zone right here at 60, and it takes a look at the master server to see if it's incremented or if it's a higher number than 60. And if it is, then it goes ahead and pulls that transfer. If I click Transfer Master right now and refresh the screen, then we see that there's been no changes. I could also right-click here and choose Reload from Master, and if you do that very often, it will also immediately expire first. Now let me show you that in the Event Viewer. The Event Viewer, by the way, is very useful for tracking various DNS events that might take place. So here, when I did that transfer, it said that it could not obtain a successful zone transfer because the zone expired. This frequently happens when you right-click here and choose Reload from Master. But if you just hit refresh real quick, it comes back right away. So it's just kind of a quirky little Windows thing again. And indeed, we see that there was an incrementation to 61. Now, there was an incrementation there, but when I chose Transfer from Master, it didn't pick that up. Notice that it just stayed at 60 after I hit Transfer from Master. That's because it's not as urgent as a Reload from Master. A reload from master might expire the zone immediately, first of all, but then it'll just allows you to refresh it and see the information, but it's much more urgent than a transfer from the master. In any case, what do we have with a stub zone, and how does it differ from a delegation? In basic function, it does the same thing as a delegation, because all we really are most interested in is the NS records, or the name server records, but it also adds a start of authority record, and it needs that so that it can identify the serial number to see if there's any updated information that it needs to get. Remember, a stub zone automatically updates any changes to name servers that I have here, and it needs the start of authority serial number to detect that. Because if I add or subtract name servers on the master server, then this serial number will change as well. Then my stub zone knows to be able to make a change to its list here, because it'll pull it down from the master. The other difference we see here is that I've got not only the name server record for dcnugget3.tucson.nugetlab.com, but I've also got its host record. Now, this will also be called a glue record. Glue, of course, attaches two things together, and a glue record here attaches this dcnugget3 host name with this IP address to this name server record, so that when DNS servers or anybody tries to query for NS records, it can immediately resolve that to an IP address. Well, that kind of opens a question as well here. Well, why do I have a glue record for dcnugget3, but I don't for dcnugget4? Well, actually, it only shows you the glue records visible here for any hosts that also register in the same domain. So dcnugget3, if we look at that, notice that it registers in tucson.nugetlab.com, so therefore it makes sense that it would have its own host record or glue record in this same zone. Now, this is also where Microsoft documentation is flatly wrong. It says that it will keep a glue record, but it's invisible, as if by magic or something like that. Well, no, that's not actually at all the case that happens. As long as it registers in the same zone, it will appear here. But what about dcnugget4? Well, you see, it doesn't register in tucson.nugetlab.com. It registers in nugetlab.com, and if I look at that, I see that indeed I have a dynamic registration here for dcnugget4, and anybody that looks for this name server here will still be able to resolve it back to nugetlab.com. Alright, well, I was just about to finish up this nugget, go get myself a cup of coffee and relax for a little while. But I'm going to hold off on my cup of coffee to show you something else. And I'm doing this just for you, so pay attention. Down here on tucson.nugetlab.com, the original zone, the original Active Directory integrated zone where I created it here, I did not allow zone transfers to dcnugget1. And let's go ahead and verify that. Right, click on it, choose Properties, choose Zone Transfers. It's going to any name servers, any servers listed on the Name Servers tab. On the Name Servers tab, there's no dcnugget1 here. And I point that out to shoot down a misconception. A lot of very technically adept people have told me, James, you have to allow zone transfers in order to allow this zone transfer, or allow this zone to be created as a stub zone elsewhere. Well, you don't. I mean, I just created a stub zone, and we never allowed zone transfers to it. And it makes sense, because DNS servers are designed to freely give up this kind of information. The SOA, NS records, and host records. If they don't give that up to other DNS servers, for example, then they'll never be able to resolve any queries. Those other DNS servers will never be able to resolve any of this, because they'll never find out where the host records are for their DNS servers. So it makes sense that this stuff is freely given up. And in fact, let's go ahead and just do something else just for fun here, a little experiment. I'm holding off my coffee even longer for you. What we can do is we can even create stub zones for public internet zones. For example, if I've got a lot of users that use Yahoo just all the time, I could go to a command prompt here, do an NS lookup to find the name servers for Yahoo. So I'm going to type set type equals NS. Remember I showed you how to do that earlier. I'm going to type in the name of the domain, yahoo.com. Press enter, and it gives me the name server internet IP addresses for each one of those. So let's see, we got 66.218.71.63. All right, let's go ahead and create a stub zone for yahoo.com. Right click here, choose new zone, click next, and you've seen me do this before, so I'm going to kind of quickly go through this here. And then we'll just enter in yahoo.com. And next, and then we'll enter in one of those IP addresses, 66.218.71. Do you remember what it was? I think I remember what it was. 63, there we go. And none of them are local, so it doesn't matter if I check that box or not, so I'll just leave it blank. And then next and finish. And then there's yahoo.com. And you're saying, ha, James, I thought it wouldn't work, and what do you know? Sure enough, it did not work. Well, yeah, watch this, smarty pants. We'll right-click on it and choose Reload from Master. Refresh the screen. Now, see? Good thing we didn't bet money on that, or you'd owe me some money here, see? So there it goes. We now have all of the name servers for yahoo.com, and we can quickly resolve against them. Now, let me show you another advantage of that as well. And here's where I can show you that advantage. Remember this diagram I showed you a little while ago? Well, here we had a DNS client looking for www.west.cbtnuggets.com, and we had to kind of go through a circuitous route to be able to get there. We had to go to our configured DNS server, then to the root DNS servers on the internet, then to a top-level domain server, then to cbtnuggets.com, then to its child domain, www.cbtnuggets.com, which finally sent an answer back to us, which finally gave us the IP address for the host record, or the CNAME record for this www record, which we passed back to the client, when the client then went back to directly contact this www server. Wow. Well, if we know we're going to go access west.cbtnuggets.com to access their web servers or whatever else they got, then we can just immediately put that into a stub zone. So if we create a stub zone for west.cbtnuggets.com on this server right up here, that was a pretty crooked square. That's supposed to be a square there. Anyway, now if we got that stub zone there, we no longer have to go here and then recursively get an answer back. And then here and then get an answer back. And then here and then get an answer back. And then here and get an answer back. Now instead, we can directly go from this DNS server right over to this DNS server to find the answer and immediately pass that back. So that's like two steps going on in there instead of all this other nonsense. And that's another big advantage of creating stub zones, is they make your queries much more efficient. In this nugget, we discussed DNS, and this was part 2, and we saw that we can install Active Directory domains, and when you do so, it also installs Active Directory DNS domains. In fact, you cannot really install Active Directory unless you have properly configured DNS. And if it's not properly configured, the wizard to install Active Directory can actually offer to install it for you. We also saw that installing Active Directory has some pretty important considerations for your WAN. You might have Active Directory traffic that's more than you counted on, or you might have zone transfers that are more than you counted on, in which case you might need to move your Active Directory zone. And really, it's more a matter of deleting a zone and then recreating it in another location. And then, of course, you're going to miss certain records, and we saw that. And we also saw that you can fix that as well. Then for your child domains, you might need to create a delegation, but the problem with a delegation is, although it points to an authoritative name server, if any changes occur, then there's no way to update those delegations automatically. And that's where stub zones come in, and that's where they often are replacements for delegations these days. And of course, a stub zone does not have to be strictly for child domains, but that's often how they're used. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.